Greetings, YouTube. I just finished reading the 5th edition of Talislanta, and I mean the version of Talislanta written for the 5th edition D&D, because there actually is a 5th edition Talislanta as well, it being the 5th iteration from that same company, or the same lineage. I don't believe it's the same company. I don't think all of them are written by the same company, but I'm not positive on that one. And I own the physical copies of all the original Talislanta stuff, and I own a physical copy of the D20 version, which I just put a digital copy of that on my phone because I wanted to take a look at it as well as the Naturalist's Guide from the original version because it's just so damn pretty. I just love those monsters, and the picture illustrations are just so evocative. The illustrations from the original Talislanta books, which were used again and again in the later editions, are just incredible. I love those illustrations. They're just, they set the tone for that world so well. But while I was reading the 5th edition, or the 5th edition, D&D 5th edition version of the game, I'm older now. I'm 57. I'm not the same wide-eyed, starry-eyed gamer looking at new game, cool pictures. No, I'm a little more jaded, I guess. My friend Amy would just probably say I'm cynical. Um, and while I'm reading it, Talislanta and it's called Talislanta the Savage Lands. It is a low fantasy, grim, dark setting. Okay? So it comes across to me now, today, as almost a parody, as satire of what a grim, dark setting is. And now what they do with that setting is interesting. For example, they suggest, okay, here's the setting, and you can use it as just a setting for a standard D&D game, but that's going to be completely and absolutely the wrong way to come at it. The tone of Talislanta is low fantasy, and standard D&D, all editions of standard D&D, are simply too high magic. They're high fantasy, and they're too powerful. Second idea they suggest is that you could use the standard classes, but you just cake all the casters out, gone, as well as any psionic classes in case you're using those in, say, a Pathfinder or 3.5 version. You wouldn't be using those either. So you've got a low fantasy setting, and there are going to be very few people who are using magic in that world. They're probably all going to be NPCs if you're going to be doing that kind of a model. The third option is they present you with a generic class for D&D 5th edition, and it is available to everybody. Everybody gets the same class, and you customize it based on what you want as for traits. And some of those traits can be magic, but they're very, very low powered stuff, like creating potions, charms, things like that. There isn't a lot of actual spell casting in the game. It's very low magic. The whole thing is. But that's the vibe. If you're going to Talislanta, that's what you want. It's a harsh realm. It is right up there with Hyperion, that whole thing going on. Though if you're doing the 5th edition, AD&D 5th edition, they do still have the 20, the cap on stats at 20, which means you couldn't actually play Conan yet. One of my complaints about 5th edition. But um, I'm reading this and I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is perfect. Anybody who wants to play a low fantasy, grim, dark D&D 5th edition game, this is right up your alley. It's perfect. And it would be easy to port that entire idea over to any other setting you want to. If you just want to take their suggestions for powers and stuff, you don't have to use the Talislanta system. You could use this to run Hyperion for D&D 5th edition without any difficulty whatsoever, particularly if you are like a scholar of Conan. I'm not a scholar of Conan. I know that there's a lot of depth there that I'm missing, but it is an interesting setting, and it would be perfectly suited to the idea of that generic D&D 5th edition class. But I'm looking at this and I'm like, this is so dark. I could never run in this system. I would feel as a GM, I'd be like, I mean, everybody is this. It's not just morally gray. It's like everyone is an anti-hero. There are no real good guys. Um, I need a little bit more light in my games. So I thought about it. What would I do if somebody said, okay, you have to use Talislanta for whatever reason? Maybe I lost a bet. So what I want to do is I'm going to take Talislanta and use the Atlantis lost continent vibe. So at some distant past in your world, or Forgotten Realms, or Greyhawk, or whatever world you're running, there was an island continent called Talislanta, say 12, 15,000 years ago. And all of the species, all the hominid species, were pretty much at the either stone tools or Bronze Age. Whereas people on Talislanta were super science. They were arcane magic up to the wazoo. They were some of the best arcane casters that the world has ever seen, even in the high fantasy future that the game that D&D Fifth Edition presents to the player right out of the gate. And eventually, they decide to create a great machine. What the great machine does is immaterial; doesn't matter. Um, when they finally go to turn the great machine on, the gods are like, we've had enough. You are messing with reality in a way that we don't like. You are getting very close to the kind of power that we wield, and so we're all going to kind of combine ourselves here, and we're going to put a big friggin' nope on this, and the entire continent just disappears, and it reappears on a planet which is a lifeless rock revolving around a double sun. So suddenly Talislanta goes from like a tropical or semi-tropical island paradise with all the super science to a place where there is literally no life except for this continent, and it's landlocked. There's no oceans on this world. So suddenly Talislanta's all their seas disappear because they're not connected to an ocean anymore. They just drain away, leaving huge salt deposits behind. Water is rare and hard to find. It's in crevices and underground and stuff because there's no rain in this world. The only air is in this area. And if you walk off the continent into the wasteland, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until you die. So you have to stay on the continent, try to survive. And it's instantaneously harsh. It's absolute chaos. Buildings collapse. It's every disaster you can imagine all at once happening. And what comes out of that is a harsh world. It is the savage lands. Um, and that's what the world looks like for the folks in Talislanta. That's why it is the way it is. Now you could do one of two things with Talislanta at this point. Uh, you could just run it like it is in the book. Talislanta is for 5th edition D&D. Or you could do a little bit different. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So eventually, takes thousands of years. The arcane casters that are around, and the scholars and the mages and sages, there are people that are passing themselves off as spellcasters, even if they aren't really all that great at it, finally discover the machine again. And then they spend hundreds of years rebuilding it. The problem is they're not as good. They don't know how it fully functions, and they don't have anywhere near the power that their ancestors had. So they activate it, and they succeed in returning the continent to the world they came from, whatever that world was. And again, you get two options. One, you leave it just like it was. So on the continent of Talislanta, magic pretty much doesn't work. So any spellcaster that shows up on this, their spells disappear. They will only be able to utilize the type of things that the casters on Talislanta can. Um, but non-casters are pretty much not going to be affected at all, so they could adventure quite nicely. And people want to adventure in Talislanta because it's full of resources that the rest of the world doesn't have. It's got black iron and red iron and dragon oil and exotic animals and plants that nobody else has ever seen before. because it's been 15,000 years, and these were unique to this island. So we're kind of looking at this as being a harsher version of like Australia. It's actually as dangerous as people think Australia is in our world. Um, but there is a better life for the folks on Talislanta, particularly if you are in the area that used to be the shore, because it's a shore again, and the seas fell back up because there's now an ocean connected to Talislanta or surrounding it. The entire world will probably suffer because there's going to be tsunamis when this land thing shows up, huge earthquakes, and the ocean levels may actually rise slightly because now there's a continent displacing all that water. So that could have an impact all over the world. But again, people want to come here. If you want to, you play it just like that. This is an island where magic just doesn't work very well. You want to come here, you can, but casters are really going to be unhappy. Um, and that doesn't, in the gods themselves have pretty much shunned this place. So even divine casters can't really do much here. Or you can take a second route where magic comes back, but gradually and to a limited extent. So as soon as Talislanta returns, everyone on the continent that is an arcane caster suddenly has access to cantrips. Now cantrips are baby spells. People on the rest of the world are like, yeah, cantrips are stuff we teach children. But suddenly that's a major game changer on Talislanta to suddenly have access to spells that you can cast again and again and again and have them be reliable and repeat. Anyway, they do the same thing every time you want to use them, which is not something they're necessarily used to. Because again, they're from a low fantasy, or were from a low fantasy setting. And then you say like 10 years after the continent returns, they get access to first level spells. And then 20 years later, they had access to second level spells. And then 40 years later, they get access to third level spells. And that is where I would personally cap it. I'm kind of doing the E6 thing. If you don't know what E6 go look it up. There's also an O7 version of that. I've seen a P6, which is a Pathfinder version. So these are all essentially capping most class abilities at a certain level to keep the sweet spot of gaming and adventuring where a lot of people seem to think they have the most fun, or they feel they have the most fun. I shouldn't say they think. That's where they have the most fun. Um, it seems a lot of people don't like high-level characters, and I can understand that to some extent, but I don't mind them. So now casters from outside the continent can show up, and they'll be able to cast spells all the way up to third level, if that's the era they enter. If they enter in the first level era, then that they can only cast first level spells. You get the point. And then this limits them, but it opens up the island continent to casters to a much greater degree. And if your adventuring party is like 7th level or under, they won't even notice the difference. Those are the only spells they have access to anyway. So they could be there, and you might get a reputation for like Talislanta is the place where young adventurers go to prove their mettle, and till it's like a rite of passage. It's a survival of the fittest test. It is pass or fail. You go to Talislanta, you make some money, and you come back. Or so maybe even like the barbarians who want to try their hand at it, maybe they just get a trophy of some kind to prove that they were there and they did something. They kill a specific beast, they come back with their horns or their skull, they get themselves a really cool a black iron or red iron weapon, and they return to the rest of the world for the rest of their career. They don't ever need to go back. There's also all the people on Talislanta can now leave. They don't have to stay there. But they discover something. The plants and animals from Talislanta won't procreate off the continent. And they discover that none of the species here can procreate off the continent. So you can go adventure in the rest of the world. You can be exposed to all kinds of magic, high fantasy stuff. But if you want to settle down and have a family, you have to go back to Talislanta. Doesn't mean you can't find a relationship someplace else and adopt. That's quite a viable option, and maybe some powerful magics could make it happen for you as well. But your average person isn't going to be able to pull it off. And I think remember most people in Talislanta magic was never an option anyway. They just don't really think in that mode, so it may never occur to them to like go seek some kind of fecundity magic that's really powerful, fertility magic that could help them in this regard. So most of them either chalk it up to I'm never going to have kids, and that's okay. I don't have kids. You don't need them. It's not a requirement. Or they go home with the wealth they have found out in the bigger high fantasy world and retire essentially to become family people. So that's how I would use Talislanta, as a lost continent that has limited magic that people could go to and have savage adventures in the savage lands, but they don't have to stay there. You are not throwing the parties into this world forever. It is a location. It is an opportunity for campaigning, maybe, or at least some decent length adventures, but you're not going to be gaming there forever. I guess, like, unless technically you want to. Um, but you have the option of leaving. And it's going to change the Talislanta as well, because now they have rain. So lakes and rivers and ponds are going to fill back up again. So life's going to get a lot easier for the people on Talislanta, even though it's still going to be one of the driest spots on the planet. The weather is never going to completely return to the way it was because frankly, the gods don't want it to. They haven't completely decided just to kill everyone. Nope, they decided it's still going to be harsh because you committed a great act of hubris, and the gods are not forgiving, even though it happened 15,000 years ago. They can be very petty. Look at how the Greek gods treat each other. Um, so this is just some thoughts on Talislanta. When I'm reading the book, I'm like, there are some things I think are pretty cool here, and there are some things I don't think are pretty cool. How would I use it? And what I'm describing is system neutral. You could use it in any fantasy system you want, or any version of D20 games you choose. You don't have to be talking about 5th edition. You could use it for P1 or P2. You could use it for 3.5 or just some generic version of uh, the game, because there are generic D20 games out there and stuff. Radiance would fit right into this world with some tweaking. So yeah, it's a generic system I think that could be used for pretty much any setting you wanted, or any game system you wanted to. It doesn't even have to be D20, obviously. You could use it for Harp or Ice or whatever. Um, RuneQuest, things like that. You could use that without a problem. So, have you folks ever used Talislanta? Has it at least been an inspiration to you? Because that's how I used it, as an inspiration. I used the monsters from it. I used some of the species. I used some of the settings and stuff, elements in other campaigns, though I never ran a full Talislanta campaign ever, even using the first edition that came out. Um, but I did use it as inspiration, and I would just flip through that book to just marvel at the images on the pages. The art was so wonderful and so evocative. I loved it. I still do. But as a setting, it just at this point in my life just seems a little bit grimdark and satirically a parody of itself, of like what a dark savage land looks like. It's like almost like I'm looking at a Saturday Night Live version, like I am Lothar of the Hill People, that kind of thing. So I wouldn't use it straight, but I definitely could see using it as an island continent on any world that you wanted to run. That to me is the perfect use for this setting. Limited magic, low fantasy setting in a high fantasy world, which gives a lot of people a lot of options. And it also means that all the species from Talislanta now become playable species off. Great background for barbarians. I was raised on Talislanta, and now I'm in the world to prove myself out in the high magic stuff. So awesome. And there are some species on Talislanta using the D&D 5th edition. One of them gets like a +3 to con and +3 to strength. That's a massive bonus in you know 5th edition. That's just huge. Make great barbarians. It lets you spread your other stat points in different places to really flesh out your character. Um, but yeah, so let's hear your thoughts. How would you use the setting? Have you used it? Does my idea hold water? Is it? And I appreciate the fact that you've listened to me babble for 20 minutes. Thanks for being here. Hopefully you'll turn back and come back the next time.